Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring a human risk dynamic that impacts all of us, how we plan our lives. We've all experienced regrets about missed opportunities, and in a world where there are more decisions to be made than ever before, the chances of us getting things wrong are high. Equally, as society changes and technology offers and removes opportunities, conventional wisdom might not always give us the right answers. Which is where my guest on this episode can help us out. Dr Grace Lordan has been on the podcast twice before, talking about diversity, inclusion and privilege. There are links to those episodes in the show notes. Grace is the founding director of the Inclusion Initiative and an associate professor in behavioural science at the London School of Economics and Political Science, better known as LSE. And she's just had a book published called Think Big, Take Small Steps and Build the Future You Want. In it, Grace explores how behavioural science can help us make better decisions about our future to get us closer to the life we'd like to live. Whether you're thinking about changing industry, landing a big promotion, writing a screenplay, setting up your own company, or even starting your own podcast. Terrible idea, by the way. Think Big has some practical behavioural science infused ideas for how to go about it. In our discussion, we explore the inspiration for the book and the themes it covers. Before we begin, a quick request. If you like the show, then please do give it a 5-star review on whichever platform you're using. It really does help the show to grow and allows me to continue to attract high-quality guests like Grace. With that said, let's get on with the show. Please enjoy, as I know you will, my conversation with Dr. Grace Lordan on Thinking Big. Grace, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. This is my third time.
I know this is record-breaking stuff, so congratulations and thank you.
I'm really excited. To be here for the third time. It's a lucky number.
So last time we spoke about a number of different topics, but you are now the publisher of a best-selling book, and that's why you're here today. So we've talked about you before. Can you just come in and you Think Big? What was the inspiration for writing it?
So I didn't publish it. It was published by Penguin, thank God, because that is something that's beyond my capabilities. I've spent a lot of time going to companies talking about differences in behavior between groups and why that might actually affect outcomes within companies. And when you give these talks, if you give them to large audiences, very often the core of the audiences are very young people who've just started in the firm. So they'll often ask questions, actually. And you know, at the end, they would say to me, you know, I think your talk is really, really interesting, but you focus an awful lot on firm policy. What can I do as an individual for my career and to make sure that other people don't necessarily get in my way? And that's where the idea for Think Big came. So moving from talking about firm policies, which I've been doing a lot up to this point, to talking about the kind of policies that individuals should adapt for themselves, if you like, in order to make sure that they keep moving forward in their career.
And you're quite right to pull me up. You're, of course, the author, not the publisher of the book. So thank you for correcting that piece of error on my part. I looked at this in the sort of the field of your work to say, you know, what you've described there is you're going into companies and effectively telling them how they're not getting the best out of their human capital. And the book kind of does the same thing, but for individuals, and says, actually, how can you get more out of yourself? How can you deal with things? And I, you know, as I described to you before we started recording, I look at this as kind of managing your own human risk. There are a ton of things that we do that, in fact, is self-sabotage, that we're just not giving ourselves the maximum opportunities. And what you're doing is beautifully exposing some of those things.
Yeah, I really like that. You know, I think at the extreme as well, some of the biases that are covered in the book can get you in real trouble. So, you know, I think you've probably talked a lot about confirmation bias on this show. So the idea that we seek out people who have the same opinions for us. And I speak about that from a career perspective and Think Big. But you could imagine with respect to risk in the company, if we have a whole bunch of people who are just seeking out, you know, others to tell them that their beliefs are true, it could land the company in hot water. So you can see this on a continuum for sure.
And what I loved about the book is it's very personal. And so this isn't a sort of a lecture to other people about this is what you people need to, you do delve into some personal experiences that sort of say, well, this is where I got this wrong. And I found that very refreshing because there's nothing worse than somebody lecturing and not kind of living the values themselves. But I mean, that must have been quite challenging to sort of explore your own failings and think about it in those terms.
So the first version had a bit of it, but not a lot. And I felt by the end that my guts were on the floor, to be honest, because, you know, Penguin really wanted the reader to be able to kind of learn about who I am. And I hope that I've done that effectively. And, you know, when I read the books, I did the audio for anybody who's listening. I'm sorry about the speed of the audio. Hopefully you can slow it down. But when I did the audio and I kind of reread it, it reminded me of when the editor, my first editor, Jack, when he took on the book, he basically said, you know, I really think you're perfect to write this. And I was like, oh, you know, you mean my background? He was like, no, because you're very like the average person, which really felt like a kick in my head at that point in time. But now I feel, now when I kind of read it back, I'm kind of sick of reading books where people put themselves out there as being superhuman and where their ego stands in the way of actually saying anything real. And I think here I do talk about kind of times in my career that, you know, move faster than others, and the times as well that went slower. Hopefully there's I try to do it with humor. So hopefully people will find it a little bit entertaining, but also as an illustrative example that if you don't pay attention to these biases, you can end up going much slower in life than you might want to go. And
there's an amazingly topical thing, which like you could almost not have chosen better, which is you talk about fear of syringes and injections.
Yes.
Which, of course, is incredibly timely given what's going on with COVID. I wonder if can you just explore that a little bit for listeners? Because I think that's a really, one, timely insight, but secondly, fascinating and gives a real sense of what the book's about.
Yeah, so I'm interested in narratives, so kind of the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. And when I was younger, I was incredibly fearful of needles. I mean, I have gone to hospital from fainting, but when I've had needles, my dad used to accompany me up to when I was very, very old, kind of to have needles done. And sadly, when I was 31, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And in the hospital on that evening, my partner was there. And I remember saying to the consultant, you know, how long can I live without the injections? My fear was that level bad. So, you know, for people who are listening, if they can identify their biggest fear, for me, it was needles at the time. And when I kind of think about how my narratives have changed over the last years, I really have managed to banish this fear of needles. I still get slightly squeamish when I get blood done, but I do inject, you know, 4 to 5 times a day, depending on what I'm doing and what I'm eating. And if you kind of take that, you know, that's life and death. So I had to change my narrative. But if you take that to kind of other areas of life, how many people do you know used to tell themselves that they were a smoker and now they're a non-smoker? How many people do you know who you say, I'm somebody who works 50 hours a week and now they've managed to have a work-life balance? How many people do you know used to tell themselves a story that they're not good enough to do something and now they've managed to kind of achieve great feats? And really getting people to pay attention to kind of the stories that they tell themselves, particularly with respect to careers. So I use the syringe example as an example of where I've massively changed my narratives. But it's the same thing if you're somebody who's at home saying, oh, I don't have time for that. I'm somebody who's too busy. I'm somebody who's not good enough. All of these things hold us back, and they're our own constructs. So in the same way that we think about social norms defining environments at work and where people end up, we ourselves construct kind of this idea of what's a normal picture of ourselves, and we live up to it or live down to it depending on what type of stories we're telling ourselves on a regular basis.
And I find this really fascinating because it is, as I said before, sort of self-sabotage. We really are. And, you know, the reason you could write a book on this, there's a ton of these things, a ton of examples where our natural tendencies, you know, are really, really unhelpful. And I'm fascinated by why that is, because on the one hand, I can make all the evolutionary arguments for why some of these things exist. And you can sort of see that there are situations where it makes a lot of sense, where we don't have the cognitive capacity to think too hard and therefore shortcuts make sense. But it seems like, you know, there's a ton of these things that are working against us. Have you got any sort of thoughts around why that is? Because it seems like we've missed an evolutionary trick here if all these things are holding us back.
I think they keep us comfortable. So I think as human beings, you know, when we think about evolution over a long window of time, it's easy to see big changes. But if you think about kind of evolution over a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year period, the human tendency is to stay inside our comfort zones. So, you know, kind of, I talk about in the book the idea that one of the best things that you can actually do for yourself is be the person who's the least smart or the most stupid in a room at any particular period of time, because then you're going to learn the most. But we feel so bloody uncomfortable in that, putting ourselves in that position. Most of us actually avoid it. And most of us us avoid saying, I don't know. Most of us avoid asking questions of things. So when we choose people to be around us in work, very often they're our own level. One of the strongest kind of stylized facts that comes out of economics and behavioural science is that people revert to the mean. I've never seen a case that actually that defies that logic. For me, it's almost like gravity, this idea of mean reversion. And if you think about what that means, if you're constantly surrounding yourselves with people like you for your own learning, it really means that you're actually holding yourself back. And behavioural science talks about ego. And I think ego is just one of the biggest things that if you want to advance in your career, if you can overcome ego, the idea that you feel terrible about yourself if you're not perceived as smart, and you feel terrible about yourself if you're not being picked as number one. That's the thing that will actually help us advance. So I think it's very human to have these narratives, and they are, even though they're cruel, I think sometimes the way we talk to ourselves is very cruel. I think ultimately they're trying to protect us against rejection, against failure, and against putting ourselves out there. But sadly, to move forward, we have to go out there outside our comfort zone. We have to fail, and that's ultimately what allows us to progress.
And there's something interesting about in the sort of prevalent narrative at the moment around sort of winners and losers. And Donald Trump, the way he talks about losers, is illustrative of this point, that there is this kind of public narrative about success is good and failure is somehow mocked and bad. And we kind of, we laugh at people that get chucked off TV talent shows because that's the way the things are set up. At least I do. And I know I probably shouldn't, but that's the way these things are set up. And so there is this prevailing narrative that we always need to be successful. And I think that strikes me as being one of the things that holds us back. And I don't know, it seems to me it's got worse in recent years. Is that something you've noticed, or?
So I think polarization and labeling has got worse in recent years. And I hate the label of success and failure. I absolutely hate it. I think it's bad for business. I think it's for a lot of the kind of core stuff that you talk about here, it's really bad for finance, actually. But if you think about us as individuals making decisions, if we label things as success and failures, we are going to conflate luck with the inputs that we're actually putting in. So everything about Think Big is about moving away from this kind of outcome-based thinking to a process-based thinking and thinking about what are the inputs that I'm actually putting in. So when I have a success or when I have a failure, particularly if it's a big one, I will reflect on what went right and what went wrong. And sometimes my successes are just down to dumb luck. And sometimes my failures are just down to people being stupid and actually making the wrong decision. But I think that level of self-reflection is really, really important. And I think kind of Donald Trump rhetoric of kind of always labeling things in binary, good and bad, evil, not evil, whatever is the opposite. My brain isn't working well today. Success and failure, which is what you're asking me about. I think it's really harmful for society. I really do. I think we're at our best when we're able to kind of fall down and make mistakes. And actually, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently, and hopefully I'll have some good thoughts on this in the next few months when I have time to think, is what does that actually mean with all of regulation, right, in finance? So if everything is so regulated that failure isn't okay, what does it mean for creativity? What does it mean for innovation? But now I would just say I think that labeling is really harmful for us.
One of the other things I loved about as I was reflecting is the book is a very helpful guide to thinking about careers in the 21st century. Because if I look at, what is going on in the world, there are plenty of jobs out there. I mean, I've perpetually done a job that my parents don't really understand, and that's just continued into what I do now. But those traditional career paths of sort of join an organization, stick with them forever. I mean, academia might well be the one exception where they're still probably a bit more prevalent. But there is this, there isn't necessarily a guided career path. People don't have jobs for life. They move around, they do different things. And so we're navigating a turf where the traditional indicators of success, which would be, a bigger job to a bigger office, if you like, that you end up in the corner office, you got the word director in your title and those, all of that's falling away. And so this, we can be very successful working on our own. We don't have to necessarily work for a big company. There's all sorts of rules that are being broken. And so one of the things I thought was really interesting was you're helping people to navigate that a little bit, because if you cleave to traditional metrics for success, actually that isn't necessarily indicative of success in the 21st century.
I think you're absolutely right. And actually what you just said really depressed me, because just before COVID, I got a corner office and I also got a director title. I'm proud. That doesn't mean anything apparently. Well, that's okay. But I am on your side. And I think, I really encourage the idea of taking this task-based approach to choosing occupations and figuring out what are the activities that you like to do? Because even though you mentioned, I mean, there will be academics forever, I think, but the tasks that we do now are very different to what we did. I mean, COVID has really disrupted it. But even without that, you know, if I look back 10 years ago, my job has actually changed and the label is the same. So I think moving away from aiming for a label and looking at what are the tasks that I want to do on a day-to-day basis, and then figuring out what occupations will allow you to do that. And I think a lot of the mismatching in labour markets and a lot of the frictions that we have are people when they're younger over-obsessing with the name of occupations. And like you say, over-obsessing with status and lifestyles that you might actually get to achieve, and not really thinking about what they want to enjoy doing. And I think if you take that approach, I think three things happen. So first, you're much more likely to do the activities and throw yourself into them, which I think is really important, that, you know, that you have a job that actually gives you purpose. Secondly, you're likely to be happier. But I think thirdly, which really kind of goes to your point, you know, the world of work is changing. And people who are being displaced by COVID and by the fourth industrial revolution, unless they have a really good idea on what are the things that they can actually do that add value to society and what are the skills that they have that are transferable, they're much less likely to adapt to the changes that are coming. So for me, I would much prefer if people gave me a string of you know, skills that they have and activities that they like doing than focusing on that one occupation title.
And talk to us about the title Think Big. Because I mean, I love it. It's a very compelling, visionary title. But I think the word "big" I think is really interesting in that context.
Yeah. Well, also I will say that Donald Trump has a book called Think Big. So if somebody is listening, it's actually Think Big. I didn't know it until it was too late.
You've got to hope that they don't put them in the same section by mistake,
and that people don't buy it.
You could leak sales in a really interesting way.
I know. Hopefully, I sell more than him. You know,
tap into a different audience. You know, I mean, it could work both ways, right?
It could. So really, the idea behind Think Big is getting people to realise that if they take a medium-term outlook to kind of career planning and their future, that a lot of good things can really happen if they aim for something that's quite substantial. And that's essentially where the title Think Big comes from. So the activities-based approach that I just described is used to back out this kind of big goal that people will ultimately aim for. And that's always in their mind's eye of what they're actually going towards. And then the rest of the book is really about the small steps, actually. So what are the small steps that you do daily to kind of build these habits? You know, we've spoken about narratives already. So if you commit to small steps and if you ingrain them as habits, it will change your narrative. But also, you know, one of the great things about behavioural science is that it's shown a number of times that when we do these kind of small actions, they have disproportionate effects on big outcomes. So that's really the core of the book, is that, you know, you're aiming for something really, really big. But in order to get there, it's about these small things that we're actually doing daily to kind of nurture that goal.
So it's a sort of cognitive workout, you might say, in the same way that we know we need to do exercise every single day. We can't just like go to the gym once a year and hope that covers it. There's something of that in this as well, isn't there? In terms of thought processes and how we look at the world.
There is, and I think, you know, I like the analogy because, you know, people who enjoy running will say they can't be without running, and I think, you know, as someone like me who kind of does the type of activities that are in Think Big, these regular small steps, kind of investing, I guess, in cognitive workouts, if you want to think about it that way. It's the same thing. So if I don't get to do it for a while, if I end up being in, you know, endless kind of boring meetings at work, I really, really kind of itch to kind of find my flow and do something that's, you know, that's quite creative and kind of advances me as a person. So it's exactly the same thing. And just like exercise, it should fade into the background after a while because it becomes a habit. It's something that's actually part of you rather than something that you have to plan to do. But I would argue that this type of investment is much more enjoyable than exercise. I've never been somebody who's actually enjoyed the exercise.
I think it's, you know, it's fast. I find the exercise thing's fascinating, right? Because there is this big myth that it's a lot of fun, and and there are people I recognise for whom that is absolutely the case. But there are a ton of people out there who cannot stand it, for whom the idea of going to the gym or going for a run is abhorrent. And I love somehow this narrative of it's a lot of fun has taken hold. And we know that for many people, that's just not the reality.
Yeah, I mean, I do it, but I go through it. Whereas with the small steps that I have to do in my career, this is actually something that I enjoy doing. And you know, I think as well, you know, most of us are going to work incredibly long hours. You know, I had 3 meetings this morning with collaborators with me who work in corporate companies, because I'm collaborating with some companies now on some data stuff. And every person who was on that call is working over this weekend, including myself. So I think if we're going to be working such long hours, or if we're going to be working weekends, it should be stuff that we enjoy. And I think if it's something that, if you're somebody who wants a better work-life balance, that you can make that happen for yourself as well by taking this long-term approach.
And I think it's really interesting when we look at some of the traditions of work that COVID and other trends, technology are kind of destroying, is that, we are now getting to a thing where actually we're starting to recognize that people's productivity isn't determined by an arbitrary 9 till 5 or 8 till 7 or whatever it is. We're breaking these things down. And so one of the things I think is interesting is when you read about a lot of your ideas and thoughts, it's really about saying, think about yourself and how can you maximize your potential, recognizing that there's no point, you have to be realistic about these things. There's no point. We all have these sort of childhood dreams of, whether it's, becoming a singer or being selected for a football team or whatever it happens to be. For some people that's realistic, but that's very, very few. So we have to kind of find out what we are good at. And we're having that opportunity now where there are lots of norms that are being destroyed, around working patterns, around what do jobs involve? Where do those jobs need to be? How do people show up for those things? What are we hiring people for? And so I think this is fascinating because it's really sort of saying, okay, to survive in that new environment, you need to work out who you are and what you're capable of. And then how do you maximize that potential?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, we swung, in the last 10 years, to people who are in the 9-to-5 jobs, really relying on their managers for career development review to give them opportunities. And there's a huge risk in that if you get a bad manager, quite frankly. So I think it's really just about taking autonomy over your own journey and creating opportunities for yourself, for yourself along the way, and being more resilient. I've started doing this work on soft skills and figuring out the wage premium of different soft skills. And the evidence for economists to date says social skills are the ones that are actually increasing in premium. But if you really delve into the kind of job flow data, adaptability is actually is the one that employers are asking for more and more and more. So how have you shown yourself to be adaptable? How can you pivot? And I think if you're not in a 9-to-5, if you're in a startup, you definitely need to be able to pivot. And even if you have a side hustle, you need to be able to pivot. And we saw that in COVID, right? When we think about the people who avoided creative destruction, it's absolutely going to be the people who pivoted their business models on that really, really key on that key occasion. So what I would love to come out of this book is, a bunch of people who work through the framework, who end up being much more adaptable to labour market shocks than they were before.
And as you were talking, it's so blindingly obvious and yet ingrained in anyone that's worked in a large company. This career, you have a career development discussion with somebody that is not you and hasn't necessarily lived your experience, that is, possibly thinking about things from a very different, and we kind of, there's an implicit thing that you'll sort of trust that to work. And of course, it's blindingly obvious that is going to be at best limited by their perspective and what is within their gift. And, that's not necessarily going to be focused on you. And so I always think it's strange. We sign this employment contract that demonstrates, there are going to be times where the company's interests and yours don't necessarily align.
Yeah.
And yet we're placing great store in that sort of, the career development, or at least we're going through the motions of doing that. And so I love this idea of kind of going, you have to rely on yourself because there is no one else that is 100% going to be there for you, no matter how close they are to you, because they can't fully see everything from your perspective. So I love this idea of breaking out of that mold. It's a really good example, I think, of traditional thinking that you unpick as you go through the book and sort of go, well, it's worth thinking about things slightly differently. And what I love about it is it's another example. It's blindingly obvious when you think about it, but not when you're in the moment.
And also it gives a very short-term perspective. So, career development reviews, when we meet managers, they'll normally talk to us, what are you going to do for the next year? What are your milestones for the next year? But the best kind of, future planning that we can do is really aim for something that's kind of a moonshot almost that we're going for. So, what you want is, the analyst coming into the financial firm saying, I want to be the CEO. You don't really want them saying, I want to have like one increment promotion in 3 years' time. How is that going to get you on fire? It's kind of like if you imagine Jeff Bezos starting Amazon years ago, if he came in and go, let's sell a small amount of books and then we'll come back in a year. No, the reason he did so well is because he said, I had this really, really wild ambition, plus kind of with that, this kind of day-to-day routine and really, really showing up for the company. And it's the same analogy here. I would love to tear up the career review process, to be honest. The forums drive me crazy on a personal level. But I think that they scar individuals who are underconfident, and also individuals like me, who when they started off in their career, didn't really have a full grasp about the career opportunities that were actually open to them, and where you could actually pivot, and where you could actually, where you could do new things. And I'm doing a piece of research at the moment, which will be out in June, and it's really striking the role of advocates actually, and the role of kind of people who are sponsoring in pointing out opportunities for people, who are in my shoes, who don't necessarily know where to actually, how to navigate. And really what we want to get to is where we're pointing out, these are the opportunities for you now, but where do you want to get to? So where do you want to be in 5 years' time? And if you don't know, maybe aim for something, and it's okay to change your mind next year, but still having that kind of big thing in the future, if where you want to end up is over the line of some at the top of some career ladder.
And talk us through that advocate's point, because I think that's really interesting, because again, the traditional model of things like mentoring would be a sort of, here's somebody that knows more than you do. And then we've seen through things like reverse mentoring, actually, that dynamic is shifting. So what does, a sort of 60-year-old white male who know about social media? Well, they might know a lot, but generally speaking, you would expect, and there's a ton of other social trends. So we've had this introduction of reverse mentoring. And I think one of the interesting challenges is I guess, how do you find somebody that can help you navigate that world? Because if you go for people that have, that are going to come to you through traditional structures, that thinking is possibly going to be encumbered. So what are your thoughts on how people can find the advocates and mentors and support that can really help them, that really be effective?
I mean, I think if you're looking for reverse mentoring and you're in a position of power, actually, there's probably a lot of people who are willing to fulfill that role. And I think openness will attract them to you. For me as an individual, I don't know what it's like to be a racialized Black man living in the UK. So for me to understand that, I need to be very, very open, and I need to listen, and I need to kind of understand what people are saying to me and ask questions. And I think if I'm running an organization, or even if I'm running a team, I absolutely need to understand the differences of experiences of people who are around me in the room. And the only way that I can do that, having not lived their lives, is be open to me telling about it. And we see more of that happening, but kind of not enough. So I think the reverse mentoring, if you are in a kind of a privileged position of leading something, there's lots of people. You just need to kind of open and stop being worried about saying the wrong thing. And it's absolutely fine to say you don't know, because how could you know? But it's actually really wrong not to learn. And I think that second part is actually, it really is wrong not to learn. And then I think if you're somebody who doesn't have the power, I think you do need to be going to kind of networking opportunities that go beyond the affinity group that you might actually find yourself in. So what that means is, if I was starting out now, I shouldn't just be going to things that have to do with women. I should be showing up to lectures, and I should be putting myself outside the comfort zone and actually talking to people and asking them for help. And it's extraordinarily hard, because, again, our ego is that we don't necessarily want to be rejected. And yes, there are some people who aren't going to be welcoming when you do that. So it's important that you don't let that get you down. But you will absolutely meet the right person, because I think that there's lots of people who really understand what it's like to kind of both be given and to give out opportunities, and are willing to do that now. But it is actually about coming outside your comfort zone. And I do worry about what COVID has done for these type of opportunities, because I think we can get on for these one-on-one calls. And I'll be honest, I've been stunned at how many really good friendships I've built over COVID. But at the same time, I do wonder, if you're younger, if you're really starting out in your career, if having that kind of physical coffee, having that physical moment where you can read body language a bit better is important. So hopefully we'll be back to normal, but definitely putting yourself out there.
And I think serendipity is an interesting one, because we clearly need a degree of luck in the world. We know that. We can pretend ourselves otherwise, but we know that that's a key component. And I think it's interesting, because on the one hand, you can say, well, actually, through digital mechanisms, there's a lot more things you can go to. So I can go to a ton of conferences. So on the one hand, I've opened up a whole load more possibilities, providing I can locate them. And there's a little bit of a curation challenge. But it's relatively easy to do that in a way that you couldn't in the physical world. On the other hand, as you say, we've lost that human component and the random bumping into someone in the coffee shop type meeting. And so I think it's really interesting to see. And I'm with you. I wonder whether, can we hold on to the good bits, which is there is a bit more accessibility to things, assuming you have access to digital services, which of course is a separate thing. But there's a lot of stuff that's gone missing. And so I'm really intrigued to see how this balances out.
But the idea of luck, and I talk a bit about this in Think Big, I mean, luck is usually when I get an opportunity that I say is out of the blue. But how many out of the blue opportunities do we really get? Usually they're from somebody who sort of knows us, that we've kind of had a friendship with, or has been the loose weak tie from us. And all of that we can construct for ourselves. So I worry about that falling away during COVID. And then I'm with you. I think we've democratized a lot of learning. So it's much easier for people to actually kind of access learning. But those are the two key ingredients. So you have, in the positive direction, you're learning. I know a lot more, but there's no point in being a genius if I don't get to have conversations with people and let them know just how good I am with something.
Talk to myself in the mirror. Yeah. It's really good, right?
And I said this actually to somebody who I'm working with recently, who's extraordinarily smart. But never really says a lot so that you would know. And I say to them, look, no one's going to know you're a genius unless you actually start talking, because, I can represent you, but then they'll think it's me, which is absolutely wrong. It needs to come out of you because I know that you know all the answers to these problems that we're discussing. So become part of the conversation. And I think it has been harder to become part of the conversation, actually. And people who've had privilege going into COVID have been probably much more insulated from this than people who don't have the privilege of networks.
I'm fascinated by what the process of writing the book has done to you, because you've clearly this is a user manual that has relied on your it's a fascinating combination of your personal experience and your academic studies. And I wonder what has that done to you? Were there any things that massively surprised you, or that you view differently having written the book than you did before?
Yeah, I think kind of, when I'm trying to aim for something, I remind myself of the lessons in the book. We've discussed the idea of ego, which I think is something that kind of pulls people back. I talk a lot about anticipated loss aversion. So the idea that when we're putting ourselves forward for something, the concern about it is enough to hold us back. And very often how we anticipate the failure, experiencing the failure, isn't actually as bad, because as humans that we adapt. And I think all those lessons have really stayed with me. And I think kind of after the book, it's kind of really broadened my view of who I should and who I could be talking to, actually, about my ideas in behavioural science. So, when I was writing it, I was really kind of writing it for somebody who really was interested in behavioural science in the beginning and wanted to apply the lessons of behavioural science to their career. But I think it ended up being much more user-friendly. So now I don't think you need an interest in behavioural science. I think people who aren't will just see this as a different approach. And I think that broadening has actually broadened my own career possibilities for the future as well, which I think is quite, because I often wonder when I become a professor, what will I do next? Because, what is that it? Is there something else? And I think it's actually broadened.
Job done. Stop,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but it's kind of, obviously you continue to teach, but, I think most of us are happiest when we're kind of like standing on our tippy toes, challenging ourselves. And I think it's really broadened my possibilities over other things that I might actually want to do later. So I'm planning on doing a podcast. Yes.
I was pleased there was a comment in there about, have you ever thought of doing a podcast, and then you hold yourself back, and it made me smile, because it took me months to get this one off the ground, and then you go, what the hell why was I worried, right? Just do it.
I'm going to be lazy. I'm going to get somebody else who knows much more about these things to do the hard part of it. But yeah, no, I'm going to do a podcast which will probably come out next January, which I'm quite excited about. So yeah, so it's broadened my mind as well. And it's broadened my mind to opportunities that come. So when people email me and something feels a bit outside my comfort zone, I'm much more likely to reply and say, look, this doesn't feel like me. Can you tell me how you think it does, or this is how I might think it would work? Does that work for you? And I would encourage everybody to do the same, essentially.
You talked there a little bit about the sort of the writing for a behavioural science audience and then shifting to a broader audience. And I love this idea of kind of a book that is almost a Venn diagram, where you're sitting and you're saying, okay, I will talk to the behavioural science audience, and they will recognise elements of what they look at. And maybe this is just a different context into which they can deploy that knowledge and understanding. But you're also bringing people, you're sort of solving a real world problem and bringing people in who may have heard of behavioural, maybe they don't even know what it is. and you're saying, let's let you in, here's a guide. And I love that idea of sitting in that Venn diagram, because otherwise we end up with the classic case of fascinating from an academic perspective.
Yeah.
But sort of how is this helping solve real world problems? And I love that you kind of went on that transition, and it does sit nicely in that intersection. And there's probably more circles there, but I'll just look at two primitively and say it's nice that it sits in that intersect that really bridges those two gaps.
Yeah, and I think from the publisher's point of view that the behavioural science audience is very, very small, and the audience is much larger. So it was very important for them that I speak to other people. But I think for me, it's really kind of, I mean, getting emails from people who don't study behavioural science and just them saying, I really see myself in the planning fallacy. I really see myself in ego depletion. So using a language that's obviously quite new to them is really exciting. Actually, it's really cool. It isn't something that I ever thought that I would be able to do or do well. But now that it's actually out there, I'm kind of excited to see who else will end up reading it and the lessons that they will learn.
Any sort of strange applications or stories? I mean, it's only recently come out, so the answer to this may be no. But is any sort of interesting? Because I think you can set it. It's really interesting. You set out with an objective and go, "This is what I think the book is for." And we see this with tech to a certain extent, right? Where some people say, "This is and then people totally use it for different things. Is any signs of that?
Well, I mean, I've had people a number of emails, people saying that they're going to use it to retire, which obviously is probably the impression. So the idea that they're going to use it to make like lots of money to retire, which I thought was quite amusing, because in the book I do stress, I think that we should be able to find purpose in our work and kind of do it for life. So the idea that they're going into it thinking about retiring, hopefully they will change their mind. I had one really interesting email from a man who is retiring, who said that I should actually have another book called Think Broad for people who are on that kind of cliff edge at 65. So rather than them, finishing work entirely, that people open their minds to other opportunities, maybe even taking a pay cut so that they can still kind of feel the purpose. And speaking of technology, I've had a number of emails from people who want to make apps from it, which I don't know whether or not we'll make an app. But again, it wasn't something that I actually expected. But I haven't. Because it only came out last Thursday, and given that I really advocate for a medium-term expedition, I don't think I could take credit if somebody said it's entirely changed their lives in 7 days. But I hope I will have some stories.
And that retirement thing, I think, is interesting, because I've sort of been reflecting on that and saying, well, why do we retire? And the answer is presumably because we've spent a lifetime doing something we don't necessarily enjoy, right? And you go, enough of this now, right? I'm just going to see the rest of my time on this planet out by just relaxing, right, and doing kind of chilled out things. And I think there's something fascinating, but it's a bit arbitrary, because it sort of goes, actually, right, your working life is done now. And I think that plays into exclusion, and, particularly digital exclusion in many cases, but also, so we're not getting the value of people's experience. They kind of retire and disappear. And you go, there's a ton of experience that we're not benefiting from. So I love that idea, because I think it's sort of, particularly as the retirement age creeps up and up and up, as more of us approach it, we're going to go, well, that number is going to be running away from us anyway. So even if that was your plan, if you're dependent on the state, that data shifting out. And even if you're privately dependent, you probably have to work for longer, as we know. Yeah. And of course you can, because of health benefits. So I love this idea of unpicking, again, a traditional structure that sort of, it was there for, possibly good reasons, but probably much more skewed towards having a life career where you were just exploited, used for something, and then we'll give you a break at the end of your life, as opposed to having a fulfilled life for the entirety of it.
Absolutely. And I think salary gets in our way at so many stages. I mean, retirement is one of them, where obviously if we've been earning a certain amount of money for a particular length of time, and we have to retire because that's the policy of our company, taking a pay cut to do something else mightn't seem appealing. But actually, if you kind of think about this as kind of pleasure, purpose, kind of trade-offs for the rest of your life, it might actually be in your best interest, and it probably is in society's best interest as well. So kind of removing, I think, the stigma that we attach to people actually taking on certain roles and on roles at lower pay levels, I think is very, very important.
And it's strange as well, because that becomes the headline, is like, how much is this going to pay me? And then the associated things, like what's the job title, all those things. But actually, the question about, am I going to enjoy this, and what am I going to get out of it, and am I going to feel fulfilled, that's not a lens through which we're necessarily historically encouraged to look at jobs. You know, there is always people will want to see the business card to see what the job title is, and people will be interested. You know, they may not be able to ask directly, but there's always a sort of implicit, you know, let's see how significant this is, and of course there are careers where that doesn't apply. You know, people on the front line in the UK's National Health Service being a good example. Nobody's stepping into that space with thinking, but there are vast swathes of careers where the benchmark is how much money am I paid, and so that makes that kind of difficult. And so this is a great example of behavioural science reframing in a way of saying, well, actually, what matters.
Yes, and you know, don't get me wrong. I have no problem with people earning extraordinary amounts of money, but I do think that it needs to be. There is a point where you need to be doing something that you will actually enjoy, or you're living a miserable existence. So, kind of factor that in as well. You know, what is the trade-off that I'm willing to make in order to have purposeful work, or can I make the work that I'm doing now more purposeful, and kind of move over to activities that I enjoy? And you know, within a lot of jobs, that there is that latitude actually, that you can kind of define the mix of activities that you're actually doing on a day-to-day basis. So thinking about it from that perspective is worth doing as well, particularly for people who are very risk averse and who don't want to move and happen to be miserable.
I mean, but that's an interesting juxtaposition, right? Because I do think risk aversion, which I'll use as a sort of proxy term for stuff that can sometimes hold us. But I mean, there's a good reason you don't want to get too crazy, right? There is a reason that we stop ourselves doing totally crazy. But that risk aversion is sort of an umbrella term that I would use in many cases for talking about some of the biases that will hold us back. So imposter syndrome would be an example of something where actually, you know, you could look at that as a form of risk aversion, and you just go, well, I don't want to be found out. So so there's an interesting thing that says actually things that feel really safe actually aren't necessarily. And so we can go, well, I've never taken any risk. I've always worked for this one. That is a massively risky proposition, actually, but it doesn't necessarily feel it. And I think that's an interesting umbrella term for many of the things that you explore in the book. You've
nothing to, and I think this comes to kind of regret. So if I'm somebody who is action biased and I typically don't take action and I procrastinate too much and opportunities pass me by, it's very hard to kind of label the regret. Right. So what do I regret? Because I don't know what might have actually happened. And you can conjure up these images of massive failure. But if I do put myself forward and I fail, then you can kind of enter this regret mode. And it's battling that, I think, is really, really key. And there's a lot of research that actually looks at long-term reflection, you know, so I think we might have spoken about this before. You know, what really irritates me a lot about behavioural science research and a lot of social science research, so it's not just my own peers, it's the entire stratosphere.
Let's alienate a ton more people, right? Let's not just go for the small group.
Is that, you know, we don't talk about life smoothing. So very often we say, if I survey people, what makes them happiest now? But of course, I think a lot of this is actually about smoothing things out over our life course and thinking about what is going to give me the most pleasure if I think about it from a life course perspective. And then taking action is absolutely something that people should be doing. And I think if we move away from the labels of failure and success, because they are just labels, right? And really focus on our inputs into those processes, it can be actually enough to get people to take action. And that research that talks about people on their deathbed and end of life, ironically, what they regret is not taking action. So when they look back, I wish I'd done this, I wish I'd done this, I wish I'd done this. Whereas when we're in the present day ourselves, we tend to regret the action if it went well, and then of course, or if it went badly. But then of course, if it goes well, we adapt very, very quickly to those successes, and we don't necessarily kind of take notice of them.
And I was thinking as you were talking about, what makes us laugh, right? Is stories, and typically, I mean, the funniest stories tend to be things that have gone wrong.
Yeah.
Right. We're not sitting there laughing about success because it's not desperately entertaining. And in fact, can get quite tedious in the wrong hands. And it sort of struck me that, that we find that funny. We find it inherently funny when people, so if you can tell a self-deprecating story about time you did something stupid, that is naturally engaging. So there is something in us that recognizes that. And I would say, if you've never screwed up, you don't have, what stories are you going to tell? How are you going to sort of entertain or amuse or engage with people if you don't have those stories to talk about? I mean, talk about other people's failures, but there comes a point where people want it to come from you. And so I see that sort of sitting together, which is kind of like, if you take the things that, if we really thought about it, we'd go, failure kind of has to exist, right? And we know that, and that's why we like to laugh about it. And yet we try and blot it out, and we try and minimize, and we try and plan in a way that means things will never go wrong, right?
I mean, for me, people should be taking risk. And I think the risk appetite then depends on how much you're actually willing to lose, right? So I don't advocate for people kind of quitting their jobs if they're unhappy, like some people do.
The book says storm out of your job immediately. Tell your employer where to stick it and put something on social media so everybody knows about it, right? That's not the general advice.
That's a different book. That might be Donald Trump's Think Big, but not my Think Big.
I am so going to send you a copy of his Think Big. I think you need to have seen it.
I think you're too late. Two people have already sent them to me.
Have they? Brilliant.
Yes, yeah. I can see it on Amazon as well. It does quite well. People buy it. So I haven't read it yet, but next time I will have a review. But no, I'm much more kind of thinking about how can we do a side hustle? How can you kind of change the task that you're doing, or how can you level up? That means that you can do something that you didn't necessarily kind of have the inclination to do before. And the risk I think you take in that process is actually down to your circumstances. But very often the only risk that you're taking is losing 90 minutes of your week. So you're actually investing in yourself either A, through continuous learning and kind of making your honing your skill or engaging in activities that the job cares about, or B, networking, kind of getting yourself out there and trying to find people who can actually give you opportunities, which is really important as well.
And I mean, wasting 90 that's really easy. Wasting 90 minutes Netflix, right? Anytime.
That's me.
Really easily achievable. I mean, that's just, we all recognize that dynamic. And it struck me that, what you're basically talking about here is, if I looked at it in sort of venture capital terms, is we kind of, we need to have a portfolio-based approach and therefore back different things. And historically, what many people do is back one project. And as we've seen with, for example, the way the UK handled the vaccine, is you back loads of them, knowing some of them might not work out. But amongst that portfolio, that number one, if they all come good, awesome. And it struck me that that's a similar sort of approach with careers, where working for one company, thinking monoline around that is a bit like backing one vaccine or one investment and desperately hoping that'll come good.
But you learn from that process as well, which is different, right? So in the diversified portfolio, there's not necessarily learning across products. But I think when you go to the company and you work for them for 1 or 2 years, you learn something about what you like and what you don't like that you can actually take on to the next phase. So it's kind of like a Bayesian updating, kind of an updating process. If you're somebody who really just doesn't know what they want to do with their life. But it's really about kind of moving people from inaction, to be honest.
And it's interesting to say people don't know what they want to do. I think that there's a fascinating narrative there around we're sort of expected to know. And of course there are some people that are lucky enough when they're growing up, they know early on, and it tends to be those careers where probably you have to make that decision early on. So, medicine's a good example, architecture. There's lots of things where you kind of need to make that call early on. There are other things where you can mess around for a little bit and then make the decision later on. But there is this interesting narrative that's there of sort of, what do you want to be? And a society, in many respects, a society, we ask kids that, right? What do you want to be when you grow up? And I kind of sit there and go, I'm not sure I've ever had the answer. And I'm spending my time experimenting. But there is a lot of societal pressure around that. You ought to know. And hence, you get people like me becoming accountants against my better judgment in some respects. And so I went through that process because it sounded sensible. And sure, I don't regret it because I've learned some things from it, and I get cheaper car insurance. That's my big plug for that discipline, right? But you sort of go that there is this expectation that we have the answer. And I think one of the things that I picked up from your book was a nice reminder that, we have a direction to travel, but we don't need to necessarily frame it in terms of this is my ideal career or my thing, because that may not exist as a concept.
Absolutely. And, obviously you're right with doctors that, you need to go in and study for a certain amount of years.
We don't want people just rocking up and going, I'll have a crack at that this week.
But a lot of them pivot. So, I spent a long time at LSE teaching on an executive master's for medics. And a lot of them do pivot into management roles and into pharmaceutical companies and into entirely different careers. And I think realizing that's okay. So, it's great advice, I think, if you don't know what you want to do, but you want a professional career, to do a broad degree. I did computer science, which people don't necessarily consider as broad, but highly employable, I think, kind of across social sciences and across the sciences. So really thinking about kind of keeping your options open. But then as you go along, working out what you like, and that might change. So in 10 years' time, Christian, you might want to be an accountant and you might have your own shop. I imagine you. I don't know why. I don't know you that well, but I imagine you next to your parents' house in your accountancy shop. So it might happen. We don't know. But I think being open and allowing that to change is really, really important, because, life is too long, and a decade is too long to spend somewhere where you just really don't like the job.
But people do, right? And I think that's the interesting bit. And, one of the other things I thought was interesting about the book is it gives you're kind of giving people as well as telling them how to do it, you're actually giving them permission to do it, because what you're doing is giving them an explanation as to the basis on which this is happening. So far from being, it's not a sort of hand grenade in the room type book where everything you thought before was wrong and here's the answer. But I do think there's something nice about giving people permission to make that shift, because they've got the explanation as to what is going on. And that for me is missing in many of these sort of career guidance and life guidance books, is sort of do this. And you kind of go, I don't understand that. Whereas I think you've given them a vocabulary and some scientific backing to be able to make those decisions.
And I think as well, the toolkit is really based on the idea of being experimental. So I kind of say, we overinterpret research sometimes with respect to causal effects and say this is something that works. But of course, it only works for a particular population, and there is a distribution. So I really encourage people to kind of experiment with the insights and to evaluate them from themselves and figure out what actually works for them, because different things do work for other people. So if what I'm trying to do is battle procrastination, for example, which I talk a lot about in the book, there's some things that will work for me and different things that will work for you if you have that issue. If what I'm trying to do is figure out how to navigate myself out of a lousy situation in work where I'm being discriminated against, again, some things will work for my circumstances and different things for others. But I think not giving a silver bullet is really important, because there isn't a silver bullet, because context really matters in behavioral science, as we all know. But it's about saying to people, these are things that worked when we look at the literature, and now you should figure out whether or not it actually works for you in an experimental mode that's very low stakes. So, nothing, all you lose is a small amount of time if it doesn't work out for you. So this is there's nothing big on the line. And
there's something interesting as well around the evolutionary thing. It says stick with the pack, right? Because that's how you survive. You don't want to be an outlier because they get picked off or ostracized. But actually, of course, nowadays, in many respects, you want the opposite. Because if you want to have a business that's successful, sure, you can go out and copy what someone else does and do it slightly better. But a more effective route, you might argue, would be to do something different that no one else is doing, or find a different angle on it. And that requires us to break out from the herd mentality a little bit.
It does. And I think the experimental approach is a really good way of doing that. So if you use a herd analogy, I imagine people maybe stepping 2 steps to the left, not too far away from the herd, checking something is working. And if it doesn't, they can go back in for a little bit of time, and then eventually and then bring themselves out. And again, all of that stacks up with what we know about human behavior. We like to feel that, we're part of a group. We like to feel that we're hidden in some ways, unless we're being applauded. So, obviously, if you're doing something new for the first time, the chances of you being applauded at your first go are very, very small. Unless you have parents like mine who suffered through me playing many musical instruments very badly, to be very honest with them. So then you might actually get applauded when you're doing something badly. But if you don't have that luxury, I think the kind of tippy-toe, little by little approach. And I'm not talking, a decade. I'm talking more thinking about this as kind of a 1, 2, 3 year kind of evolutionary period for yourself.
Right, and I love, it's funny actually, you were talking about sort of parents and, your artwork, no matter how appalling, gets praised. Your music, playing a music instrument gets, so all of these things are positive encouragement, but that sort of trains us a little bit that we need those feedback loops. And of course, in the adult world, the training course for which I still haven't found. I somehow missed the adulting training course, and the manual never reached me. But, that isn't necessarily always there. And so I think there's something interesting around we're conditioned a little bit to sort of expect praise and immediate feedback. And maybe that's what traditional structures give us, where at least you have an understanding, you've got an annual appraisal. Whereas if you're self-employed, that your annual you can give yourself an annual appraisal, but that's not forthcoming. And so I wonder whether some of these structures that are evolved come from that dynamic. And so I think thinking, not expecting that to necessarily be there and being okay with that can be quite a big shift, but it's quite liberating.
Well, you probably hadn't thought about it that way, and you might well be right, but I don't think it helps us. So I don't think it helps us for somebody to be telling me that I'm really good at something if I'm mediocre. But the reason people do that is because we want people to be happy in the moment, and getting that critical feedback can actually be hard. So, one of the things that I talk about a lot and think big is, as an individual, you should empower yourself to seek feedback that actually advances you, and how to do that. which I think is really important, because we've kind of evolved to a place where as a manager, it's much easier to tell people they're doing good than to actually really push them to be excellent, because you don't want them to be upset in the moment. But actually, there's probably people, I mean, I'm guessing the people who are picking up Think Big do want to have a change in their life. So that doesn't help them, because, you know, you don't want to be somebody who's kind of just at the average level. You want to be doing, you know, much better than you are today. And feedback is a really kind of a good way of getting that. But you need to, for some people, you need to elicit it from them kind of pretty forcefully, actually, if they are inclined to, you know, tell everyone that they're good regardless of how they're doing.
And the feedback thing, I think, is fascinating as well, because I was reflecting on kind of the career feedback I've had in the past, and very often it's feedback around how you are fitting the criteria that is set by the company. So here's a box, and let's have a look and see how do you fit into that box. And of course, that's not a box that, generally speaking, has been designed in any way, shape or form around me. It's like, you must conform to this box. And I get the rationale behind that, because they've hired you to do a specific job and they're measuring against that. But in terms of sort of personal development, I kind of sit there and go, well, if we could reshape the box slightly, then there'll be some bits of it I can fill. There's bits of it I can never fill, right? And we shouldn't even be wasting time trying to get me to fill those bits. And if we could reshape the box slightly, and the closer the box is to me, the more we can get the best out of me. And it struck me that traditional feedback mechanisms are always around that sort of, let's talk about where you didn't meet our expectations. Yeah. And that can be very powerful, depending on, but it can also be quite destructive. And so I loved it when you were talking around feedback, because I thought it was much more around reflecting on you based on a set of criteria that aren't necessarily somebody else's box, but it's literally your potential and where you could go.
Yeah, because I mean, if you're not going to define your career, somebody else is going to define it for you, and the chances of them actually picking one that suits you are really, really low. You know, so I think it's really getting people to kind of think about, what do I want to get out of that feedback session? Probably what you want to do is identify your strengths and difficulties. For me, I'm much more interested in somebody telling me what my difficulties are. I find it really boring if somebody keeps telling me that I'm particularly good at something. I think if they say it's information. But what I really want are difficulties, and really seeing that critical feedback as a gift, rather than something that's kind of a negative, kind of a dagger, really. And a lot of this comes down to handling affect or emotions. And maybe it needs to be that you receive the feedback, you take a break, maybe it's a day, maybe it's 2 days, depending on how personal you take these things, and then come back to it. But knowing that about yourself is important. Otherwise, you're just in this cycle where somebody's patting you on the head and telling you that you're doing a good job, but you're not advancing yourself. And I think to advance ourselves, we just need to be able to kind of take critical feedback. We need to be able to accept failure, and we need to be kind of outside of our comfort zone with people who are much better at things than we are in that moment. But of course, we learn. So eventually we will catch up.
Hopefully, right?
We will.
And I think that, so final question from me, which is, I think you know, there's an amazing sense of positivity in the way that you write, and you set out your stall with the title, right, which is sort of thank God it's not a book that says think small, and you know, but you set out the positivity, and I love that, and I wondered where you get your sense of positivity from, because as you go through, you can all of these things, right? There are all these headwinds, self-sabotage, reasons why. And there's plenty of reasons to be miserable in the world. And I love you have this tremendous sense of positivity, both when I speak to you, but also in your writing. And I wonder where that came from.
I don't know. I mean, my mom was always a very positive person, and she always was somebody who talked about the idea of you put in hard work. And when you put in hard work into something, you will get something out of it. And if it's not coming out of it, then you should try to figure out why, if it's kind of not happening easy. And I think the second thing that I've had going for me as well is having that fantastic hype buddy in my life at early years is, you know, I do have kind of a good network around me at the moment, which is really, really fantastic. But also when things go wrong, I generally try to see them kind of outside myself. So things that I can fix through my actions rather than them being part of my personality. So for example, if I experience a failure today, I won't say Grace is a failure. I will think to myself, you know, I failed at this. How did it happen? And if it was me, if I dropped a ball and I didn't put input into something, I'm very kind of relaxed about taking that responsibility. And I think anybody who's ever worked with me knows that I say I don't know a lot, that I ask lots of questions, but also that I really kind of see outcomes as the result of a series of actions. So figuring out what are the actions that we need to do to make something better. And also, I think I'm quite relaxed because I do think of these things in terms of these medium-term journeys. So, kind of, if I think about what I'm going to be doing kind of in 5 years' time, I have in my head what that might be now, and I meander slowly towards it. So I'm not necessarily in a rush. And I think that brings some positivity. So if things don't go right today, there's tomorrow and there's next week and there's next month, which is quite freeing, actually.
Fantastic. I love that. And look, that is a fabulous way on which to end your third appearance. Thank you so much for coming back. Thank you for amazing insights. The book is great. I will put links to that in the show notes. And the other thing I want people to do is to connect and follow you in social media, because as I was saying to you before we recorded, you are just prolific at the moment with a number of webinars, and every single one that you're participating in, I'm like, oh, I want to hear that. I want to watch that. And there's an amazing amount of stuff you're putting out. So I'll put links to all those things and encourage people to follow you there. But above all, thank you so much for writing the book and coming on the podcast again.
Thank you. And hopefully I will write another book and I'll get to come on and talk about that as well at some stage.
I would love that.
Thank you, Christian.
Grace, thank you so much. So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Grace for coming back for a third time, and to you for listening. To find out more about Think Big, have a look in the show notes. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. As I mentioned at the outset, if you like the show and haven't yet left a review, please do so on your platform of choice. It really does help. If you're interested in finding out more about human risk, including the work that I do with my clients, visit human-risk.com. There you'll also find links to the newsletter and the video blogs and other output that you might find of interest. I'll be back very soon with another episode in this series, but in the meantime, stay safe, think big, and thanks for listening.